I'm excited to talk to you about this project. I did a lot of talking about it in the spring, and then I had sort of the summer off, so now I'm restarting it, talking about it with you guys today. So I'm going to do my best to sort of, present what I have, but also I'm sort of moving on to my next project, which is sort of inspired by this. And so depending on the time, I foolishly thought I could change my phone to where I could look at a timer in the 2 minutes that she, can you give me a 10-minute, thank you. So depending on the time, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my new project that I'm working on and sort of how this has led me to that. So let's go. Actually, no, I'm starting here. So President Obama's remarks on July 19th, 2013 took everyone by surprise. Nearly a week after George Zimmerman was found not guilty of killing Trayvon Martin, President Obama walked into the White House press room and began speaking from handwritten notes about the ordeal. News channels interrupted regular programming. Correspondents working in the White House went from ambling to running at the unexpected sound of the president's voice, and Facebook and Twitter lit up. For the first time since the beginning of his presidency and 5 years after his historic election in 2008, Barack Obama stood in front of American people and spoke plainly and honestly about race and a case that had held America's attention for the previous 2 years. The president began with a slightly reluctant cadence to explain why he had gone off schedule and off script. Excuse me. After saying he would not be taking any questions, he shocked most observers by taking on the popular refrain that Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. I think that was a generous estimate. Probably was more like 40 years ago, but whatever. Could have been me 35 years ago. Indeed, black men of all ages strongly identified with the kid walking home with snacks he had purchased during a break from watching the NBA All-Star game. This was also very much a reiteration of President Obama's previous statements that had his wife given birth to sons instead of daughters, they would have looked like Trayvon Martin. He went on to talk about his own experiences with racism as a way of explaining or translating African Americans' frustrations to the larger American audience. He also pointed to black-on-black violence. He suggested that the problem of race and racial prejudice would be repaired only through efforts to deal with the anger of young black boys and the efforts of all Americans to do some serious soul searching about their own prejudices. I think at this moment it is really important to point out that the Trayvon Martin case, in fact, had nothing to do with the anger of young black boys. I mean, there was no suggestion that there was anger in any case. If anything, it was about the fear of predation on young black boys. But anyway, I'll keep going. So in terms of structure, I love when I've never written about a person who was alive before, well, that's not true. I've written about people who are alive, but the thing that I need to write about, they have done and it's over. So when you're writing about somebody who is currently doing things, it's always nice when they do things that you expect rather than take a turn where you have to then rethink the whole project you have put in place. So watching this, I thought, great, this fits what I'm already saying. It had all the ingredients of the best Obama speeches. First, he almost always offers some sort of personal connection through anecdotal family stories or through lived experiences. Second, he mirrors the high-minded discourse of the 1960s civil rights movement or the founding or some other moment that he views as unifying for the nation. Third, he serves as a racial interlocutor or translator between various groups. Indeed, he spent a good deal of time translating opposing positions in search of a workable, shared experiences and potential for common ground. He is particularly skilled at equating events that happened in the same time period, but actually represent irreconcilable actions. So he'll say something like, I understand why white kids are upset about, affirmative action and more minorities in college. Just like I understand why black people feel like they should have access to affirmative action. I'm like, those things are not just like, those are the most different things that I could possibly think of. But when he says it, you're like, yeah, just like. Anyway, he's very good. When he talks about, he's very good. Last, in his explicit discussions of race, he points to cultural stereotypes and beliefs about African Americans or cultural pathology. Obama does some of these things in most speeches. That's the thing that you should know, particularly when he's talking about race. That cultural pathology thing almost always rears its head. In the book, I realized I forgot to do something. I'm very sorry. I'm assuming this. I'm going to talk to you while I do it. Thank God for YouTube. So in the book, I start by talking about the ways in which candidates traditionally deal with race and the ways in which they try to use race in a particular way. Let me go ahead and do this. And so normally when we think about how candidates are using race, we pretty much think about it in two ways. Great, that's good enough. So we normally think about it in two ways. The first is we think about the ways in which politicians have used racist appeals to play on white fears in order to get them to not vote for either candidates of color or candidates that are supported by people of color. The second way that people use racial appeals is often used by candidates of color themselves when they are trying to inoculate themselves from racist attacks. So they're trying to universalize themselves as a way of saying, don't let what other people want you to believe about what it means to have a black representative, that they're totally in the pockets of black people. So I'm going to show you the racist ad first, and then we'll have a different example. So let's go with this.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? Harvey Gantt says it is. Gantt supports Ted Kennedy's racial quota law that makes the color of your skin more important than your qualifications. You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
So this is a textbook example of this, right? I mean, anybody who teaches black politics, I'm sure, Andre, you show this to your class. Like, I show it. Sometimes I just pull it out because when people are like, what do you mean by racism? I'm like, here you go, 30 seconds. I have it for you. It's like really easy to pull out, right? And it's that clear example of the ways, and the thing that's so clever about it is that you don't see any faces. He never says anything about race, but you learn everything you need to know in that commercial. You have a white, working class, married man who I'm sure has a family. His hands are a little aged. He's frustrated. Otherwise, why would you ball up the paper? And black people are trying to steal his job. And then flash to Harvey Gantt, who is a black person who's trying to steal Jesse Helms' job. Like, it goes from the general racism to the specific racism in an instant. I also met Harvey Gantt last weekend, like 2 weekends ago, and I was like, I mean, I know you're still alive, but I just showed that one commercial. Like, I hadn't even thought about what happened to your life after this. It was so crazy. Like, I was like, whoa, Harvey Gantt, still alive. Anyway, I knew he lived, but after this commercial, I never thought again whatever happened to him. I mean, that's the crazy part of it. So let's show sort of an example of where people are trying to inoculate themselves against this. And I show the Barack Obama one, but I mean the Deval Patrick, yes, we can, but I often have to point out to my students, many of whom who were born in, 2000, that Deval Patrick was the initiator of the yes, we can language. Barack Obama, with Deval Patrick's permission, took on that language when he saw that it was sort of an appeal that was working for him.
From the tenements of Chicago to Arkansas, from the U.S. Justice Department to the highest levels of business, his life has been the triumph of hope, hard work, and determination. Now Deval Patrick's leading the fight for change and reform, with specific ideas to reverse the loss of jobs, to boost our schools, make health reform real, and challenge the big dig culture on Beacon Hill.
You bet your life we can.
Deval Patrick for color.
I mean, it's interesting, too, because Deval Patrick, everybody would have thought was going to be probably one of the more successful candidates for president. People thought he was further down the road than Barack Obama was at the time, but, what do people know? They had it wrong. I also like to show that Deval Patrick commercial because it's it's a clear example to me of how you try to do this universal message, because it starts out where they're talking about how Deval Patrick grew up in the tenements of Detroit. And I was thinking to myself, I have never heard a black person call projects the tenements, ever. You know what I live in? The tenements. They don't say it. And so it's clearly a way for him as a person in Massachusetts, where you have all these Irish and Italian immigrants who grew up in tenements, to say, which are just projects, which is a way of saying, look, me, you, we are the same. We are the same. Anyway, I find it very interesting. I try to work on the idea, I like the statement that McElwain and Caliendo say, where they talk about the fact that all racist appeals are racial, but not all racial appeals are racist. In fact, some of them are trying to fight against racism. As a matter of fact, the times when Barack Obama spoke out against race, it was often in a defensive posture and not in an offensive posture. Wrong thing. So I call Obama the race whisperer. This comes well into 2007 as I'm watching Barack Obama mobilize all of these people, and I'm like, man, this is amazing. He is amazing. That's what I'm thinking to myself. And I was like, oh, he is the race whisperer. Me thinking about, of course, the movie The Horse Whisperer, but it turns out millennials have no idea what that is. So then I referred them to the dog whisperer, which they actually do know, because that's something that they are more familiar with. So I thought about the ways in which Barack Obama is able to use his background, his unorthodox background, to authentically and politically make useful connections to multiple groups, including whiteness without actually being white, which is sort of the first of its kind of that kind of politicking. He is able to wield race as an instrument. He can deploy it wherever he needs to in particularly interesting ways. He reads a crowd, he understands the sort of identity categories that are present there, and then he digs into his treasure box of identities, and then he says, hey, here's how this works. And I think that's the thing that led me to this notion of what it means to be a race whisperer. And that is one who is seamlessly and agilely, you have to say some of this stuff real academic, like you have to have a definition of your concept. Otherwise, somebody else will define it. You'll be like, that is not what I meant. Anyway, able to employ racial language and tropes by using personal experiences or common historical themes to engage and mobilize diverse racial communities. And what I'm saying is he moves in and out of this in a way that is seamless. It's not like people are suggesting that he is doing this in a way that is uncomfortable. And I say that because there are examples of people who have tried this in the past who have done it most uncomfortably. And the example I love to give, because it's funny to me and I like funny examples in politics, is when I lived in Columbus, Ohio, I was a part of a congregation-based protest organization. And this white woman who's running for mayor comes to a black church for an event where mayors are asked to speak. It's at a church. I like to stress that. And so when she goes up to talk, she has her purse on her shoulder. Black people are like, what the hell? Why does she have that purse on her shoulder? This is a church. Does she think people are going to steal her purse? Like, that woman, she could have had the cure for cancer and nobody heard it, because they were all like, who walks up in here with their purse on their shoulder in the pulpit? Like they could not hear it. And it was like a kind of basic cultural marker. And years later, I thought, that woman probably walks around with her purse all the time. She needs to keep track of it. Like, you never know. She's probably left her purse everywhere. Nobody is there with her. Who's holding her purse? I mean, Aretha Franklin still takes her purse on the stage, and she's been performing for 50 years. I was not that generous in the moment when I saw it, and I was like, oh, you scared black people in a church gonna steal your purse? And I was like, I'm sure she lost any potential vote that she might have had in that moment. An example of a white person, by the way, who does it very well is Bill Clinton. But the difference between Bill Clinton and Barack Obama is that Bill Clinton is building bridges. Barack Obama actually has connections to these people. He's not actually trying to tell you that I can be like you. He's actually explaining to you the ways that he is like you. Like, I actually share this identity. When he's talking to white people, he is like, I have white people who are close to me, who are related to me. It's not like when he's talking about his grandfather, the white guy, there's an actual person. So that's the thing that is different about this. I keep trying to touch that other one. This is a slide I like to call the slide for my mama, where I was like, when I started writing this, I was very afraid that black people would be very upset about criticizing Barack Obama, because I started working on this project in about 2010. And so I wanted to be clear that I'm not arguing about his intent. I'm not sort of assigning maliciousness to what he's doing. I'm suggesting that he's sort of doing what every politician tries to do, which is figure out the talents that they have and the tools that they have to make candidates, to make people want to vote for them. And I argue that he is simply doing that. Now, I also believe that he's a very smart candidate. And so he understands that he needs to do it. And so he was very clear and intentional. I think he's intentional about a lot of things that he's doing. But, you know, I've never talked to the president, so I don't have any say about that. Quickly, I'm giving you an outline of the book just to tell you sort of what I talk about. I talk specifically in a chapter about the ways in which Barack Obama uses what I call black blame, which was developed in my previous book, the way in which he uses cultural pathology to talk to black people, and what I think it sort of gets him. And I think it's actually getting him something from black people as well. I'm not arguing that. I mean, black people love tough love. I mean, they love tough love conversations. And so in some ways, it is the thing that was making him sort of most authentic to him when he was referencing these sort of cultural notes. But also, it was being broadcast across the country. And so you think about the ways in which white people, who often think things like, yeah, Cousin Pookie should get off the couch and vote, and they see him saying it, and they're like, see, even the first black president agrees with me. So you're having sort of this weird moment. I talk about his connection to whiteness through his grandparents, and I talk about his More Perfect Union speech and the ways in which I think he's sort of building some dangerous analogies that don't forward discussions about race. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite chapters to talk about because it's funny, and that is An Officer and Two Gentlemen, which is about the Great Beer Summit of 2009. Okay, so this whole presentation from now on will sort of focus on that. I focus on this incident in particular because it was a watershed moment for how Barack Obama was going to deal with race in his administration. According to the Pew, we don't think about it that much now, but according to the Pew Research Center, this was the largest single event explicitly tied to race covered in the news in 2009. So it was something that people were talking about. They talked about it on talk radio, on cable news. It was everywhere. So let me set the scene for you a little bit. On July 16, 2009, Harvard University professor Henry Louis Gates was returning to his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. After having trouble opening the front door of his house, he asked the cab driver to get out of the car and help him pry the door open. A woman is walking by and she sees these two men sort of forcing the door open. She calls 911 and tells them that there is someone who is trying to pry the door open. Some interval passes. Henry Louis Gates is in his house. Officer James Crowley shows up and basically is there to investigate the 911 call. Henry Louis Gates is already in his house, and I also believe that Henry Louis Gates had a lot of pictures of himself in there. I just don't know that for sure. But I'm like, and it's also pictures of himself with like really famous people because he knows everybody. So I imagine you walk into a house and it's like Henry Louis Gates and every president, Henry Louis Gates and every Nobel Peace Prize, Henry Louis Gates and Beyonce. I don't know who it is, but I feel like, oh, I've never been in it, but I'm imagining that that is the case. So he shows the guy his driver's license and his ID card, but it is very clear that he is annoyed by what is happening. Because he's like, look, I've told you this is my house. The investigation should be done. He gets into an argument. The police officer says that he tries to give Henry Louis Gates his information, but Gates can't hear it because he's yelling over him. Then more Cambridge police officers show up and the Harvard police show up. And so they're all at his house. Gates is like, I'm not going to argue with you about this anymore, so I'm going outside. You know, if you want to talk to me more about this, you should go outside. Like, I'll talk to you about it on the porch. This is a terrible idea. Note to self, don't go outside. Because then you are creating a public nuisance. And ultimately, Henry Louis Gates is arrested because he is creating a public nuisance on the street because crowds start to gather. I think this is so interesting because, first of all, Charles Ogletree wrote a whole book about it, and that fascinated me in and of itself. But also, Henry Louis Gates is 58 years old at the time and uses a cane. And so he has to tell the officer, look, you cannot handcuff me in the back because I can't use my cane like that. You have to handcuff me in the front. And I have to believe that at some point in that conversation, the officer would have been like, nope, I'm not going to do this. But nope, he arrests him, takes him down, he is booked and all of that stuff. You have to think about what's also happening in the summer of 2009. This is the summer of trying to get the Affordable Care Act going. There are all these town hall meetings. They are going terribly. And so people are protesting. There are people who are getting arrested. Congress people are having to show up with security. Barack Obama is on the TV like 5 times that summer trying to convince the American people that they should actually want to get their teeth cleaned and all this other stuff. And so it is a really bad moment. At the end of like a 50-minute presentation, a reporter asked the president what he thought about Henry Louis Gates being arrested. So the president, who is, not very far into his job, he's there for 7 months, he decides to talk about this. And he talks about it, and he says, I've been followed, all this other stuff. And then he says, now, I don't know the facts, having not been there, not seeing all the facts. I mean, you should have stopped right there. But what role race played in that? But I think it's fair to say, number one, that any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly and then everybody stopped listening, right? He actually had some third points, but I'm pretty sure no one ever heard it. I only saw it when I was reading this. And the second point was that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. After he says this, all discussions of health care, all discussions of anything stop completely. 2 weeks after Gates's arrest, Gates and Crowley come to the White House with their families to meet with each other under the watchful gaze of the international press and millions of people watching on cable news. Each family was given a special tour of the White House, although Gates had visited previously. After their families were done visiting, President Obama, Professor Gates, Officer Crowley, and Joe Biden retreated to the Rose Garden to just talk amongst themselves because apparently that's how nobody has ever talked amongst themselves. And so now they were going to do it and race was going to be fixed. But I want to explain to you the level of craziness that was in this moment. So as I was researching this, I found a whole set of articles that were just about the beer. And so Barack Obama, who I do not believe drinks beer, I believe he's like a Scotch man or something like that. He probably drinks old fashions because, I don't know, that's what people in the White House do. But he said, I'm going to have a Coors, or I forget what it was. It was something like that, a Bud Light. But the problem is that company had been sold to an international company and it was no longer an American company. And so then there was a whole set of articles about why doesn't he drink American beer? And then they interviewed small batch brewers like, don't you think the president should have gone with an IPA? I don't know. I don't even drink beer. But there was a whole discussion about what kind of beer he should have drank and whether or not. It was crazy. And so at that moment, things that were happening that just seemed fairly normal, like saying I'm going to have a Bud Light. If you asked me what kind of beer I was going to have, I might say that first because Spuds McKenzie. I've seen it before. But I don't have a real knowledge of it. So it all stopped. Then Obama attempts to clarify his comment he attempts to apologize by saying he had not calibrated his words more carefully. right? He doesn't apologize for what he said. He apologizes and says that he should have done it better. We now know that to get that out of him, it was Valerie Jarrett who basically, hounded him into doing it. He had no intention of apologizing even then. But the thing that's interesting is even the attempts to clarify, it actually made more people mad at him, not less. So white people were not satisfied with what he said. Black people were dissatisfied that he felt the need to say it at all. In the aftermath, we find that blacks largely supported Obama's initial position and whites took issue with what the president said. And so whites were 8 times more likely to blame Gates and blacks were 5 times more likely to blame Crowley. Not surprising. One journalist put it this way: the truth is Obama has been on probation with a substantial number of whites who were willing to take a chance on and tolerate him as long as he didn't act black. When he violated the conditions with his remark on Gates Crowley, those people yanked their probation. The meaning individuals attached to the Gates incident heavily depended on the observer's race. I realize I'm using a racial binary right there, and there are other races that might have weighed in, but they were not mentioned in any of the studies. I guess black people only matter to them, and so that's all I can talk about today. I think what's more interesting is the level of attention paid to the story and the disproportionate reaction of Obama's opponents. Right? So they began to have these discussions. Conservative media pundits and commenters seized on this moment to suggest that a spontaneous comment about a close friend's unfortunate arrest represented an underlying hostility by the president. So for instance, Rush Limbaugh believed that the president's reaction was not presidential. We got the militant black reaction. We got the Cornel West angry reaction. No one pushed this more than Fox News host Glenn Beck, who appeared on multiple shows on the Fox network during this period to discuss his belief that Obama was a racist. And I like to talk about here, to do a little bit of contextualizing, that at the moment that Glenn Beck is saying this, he is the top-rated show host on the top-rated or most watched cable news station in the country. He is not sort of the Glenn Beck that we know now, who I think is making, movies in his basement. But before, he had a whole platform that was really important. And so Glenn Beck says, the president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people and white culture. Beck expressed these views on on the Fox News morning show, Fox and Friends, if any of you have ever watched, with virtually no pushback. Another reporter responded to him by asking, where were Obama's white advisors who could help him with this? Later in the same program, Beck reiterated his belief in an oddly contradictory statement where he hedged a bit, but then returned to his initial accusation. So he says, I'm not saying he doesn't like white people. I'm saying he has a problem. This guy, I believe, is a racist. Beck's views represent the most extreme critique of Obama, but it is by no means marginal. I told you that already. By no means marginal. Let's start there. It was not until the death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his killer that Obama spoke again directly from the presidential podium. So that doesn't mean that he didn't talk about race in private circles. It doesn't mean that he didn't have meetings. It doesn't mean that he did not invite black people to the White House to have all kinds of discussions about race. But to actually stand at America's largest bully pulpit and talk about race, he does not do again until he's into his second term and Trayvon Martin's killer, George Zimmerman, is acquitted. Oh, let me say this first. I also think it's interesting here to talk about the ways in which conservatives argued against their own ideological positions even in an effort to maintain an oppositional position to the president. So private property rights and protection of those rights is a cornerstone of modern American conservatism. By modern American conservative standards, Professor Gates would have been within his own rights to shoot that cop and anybody else who stepped on onto his porch. It is what happened in Branch Davidian. It is what's happening with Clive Bundy and his children. This is sort of the way we think about it. But in a discussion where Barack Obama is even taking a position that would have been almost no sweat for them to support, they find themselves standing even outside of their own ideological principles as a way of maintaining their opposition to the president. Their opposition to the president is more important than even their own principles. But it's also important to say that whites across party lines, it was not just Republicans who were opposed to the president on this, it was also Democrats as well. So it was whites writ large, not just conservatives. President Obama's response to the Gates incident is one of his least successful engagements with race in his national political career. His goal was to place the arrest of his friend into a larger conversation about racial profiling and the continuing challenge of persistent inequality. There was no reason to believe that the nation would be opposed to this kind of discussion because they had just elected the first black president. Ironically, his discussion, this initial discussion, seemed to forestall all other discussions in the future about race. That is, until Trayvon Martin. The news website Gawker provides a photo display of 76 unarmed people of color that were killed since 1999 that was compiled in an effort by Gawker, which no longer exists, which is also an interesting political story that I should, if I were you, I would look up about how you can destroy a whole media site if you have enough money and Hulk Hogan, like literally. Hulk Hogan helped bring down a whole political media site. But and a billionaire, but he used Hulk to do it. The NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund and Gawker put together a list of people they could find. And they basically did this by looking through newspapers and newspaper coverage of police shootings, and they used names, they looked up other kinds of information to figure out sort of who were the people of color who were killed by the police. And they start in 1999, and they find that 51 of the 76 people they found, or 67%, were killed during Obama's presidency. Because national records are not kept, it's hard to know whether or not this represents a significant increase. Most of the cases didn't rise to the level of national news until after the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown in Ferguson in 2014. I think it's also important I like to point out here, something that I don't have on there, is that I live in the city of Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia, you are not even allowed to know the name of the police officer involved in the shooting unless or until they're indicted. And so if they are never indicted, you never know the name of the person. And so you have these grieving mothers whose children have been shot by police officers. And unless there's somebody on the scene who saw it and happened to note the officer's identity, you have absolutely no way of knowing which police officer is the one who is involved. And then you are expected to believe that these people are the people who are going to keep you safe when you could actually be calling on someone for safety by a police officer who is in your neighborhood, in your precinct, who actually shot your kid. Anyway, I think that's important to note. Many people in Ferguson began to ask after the incidents in Ferguson in 2014 whether or not the president would or should come to Ferguson. Obama made it clear that he was monitoring events but had no plans to go there. The president had debated whether or not to go to Ferguson with his top black officials, including, of course, Attorney General Eric Holder, who eventually went for him, and Valerie Jarrett. And they all agreed that it was too messy for him to go. Washington Post reporter Vincent Bedezik suggested that the president's refusal to get directly involved in Ferguson was directly related to the fallout of the Henry Louis Gates case. He says Obama criticized the arrest and the response by police, and immediately took flack from law enforcement organizations for bringing race into it when they felt like they were just doing their jobs. Obama later said he regretted his concert, but he shied away from stepping into similar flashpoints that have flared up more recently. According to this reporter and several others, the president had learned from the Gates incident to avoid situations like Ferguson. Okay. avoid situations like Ferguson. So this time he sent Eric Holder. I end the book talking about this because I end the book at the moment. Also, when you're dealing with live people, you have to decide what your cutoff point is. And I end really on this night. And this is the president, the first African-American president, in a dual screenshot with Ferguson. And I end at that moment to sort of talk about the thread that links Barack Obama to Mike Brown and the other people who are involved in this. And one of the things that I start to argue is that it's really a question of the right to belong. Whether Brown belonged in the streets of his own community, whether Gates belonged in his own house, and ultimately whether Barack Obama belonged in the White House. Barack Obama had spent a good deal of his political and social capital convincing people that he belonged in the White House. His ability to be elected at all was accomplished through actually doing a good bit of race whispering. That is, he was able to convince people that he was on their side. But political decisions require concrete yeses and nos. And in those yeses and nos, you often end up with people who are happy with the decision and people who are not. Ultimately, I argue that in our streets, in our homes, in our nation's most important residents, the question of belonging haunts the lives of black men and boys, but all African Americans, black women and girls as well. The question becomes, where do black bodies belong? Who maps the cartography of black lives? Who controls the spaces? And what rights are owed and offered to black people there? Which inhabitants are worthy of protection by and from those who govern? How are punishments for transgressions meted out? Is fairness a possibility? These questions are so old and so entrenched in the social schema of black people that for them, they become tiresome. No, that's not what I want to say. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. They are fixed in the social schema of black people, but for the dominant group, they become tiresome. That's what I meant. That's better. For the dominant group, they become tiresome, and sometimes they are able to move the question of race to the periphery. But the power of these questions is the speed at which they can command center stage in American life. They have the power to deliver a sucker punch to comfort and complacency. In some ways, the historic election of 2008 provided the perception of a moment of refuge from the tumult of American racial politics. In little ways, that perception of this coming era of racial unity was soundly refuted by this split screen on the night of the grand jury decision of Mike Brown. But I think if we are honest with ourselves, we will admit that it began eroding on election night 2008. And so right here, I want to tell you quickly, I have about 5 minutes, about my new project, which is called Mountaintop Removal, MLK, Trump, and the Racial Mountain, where I return to this question. So first, I start by showing my class Martin Luther King's Mountaintop speech in January of this year. And as I have them watching it, I'm listening to him talk. And I think about, so mountaintop removal, for those of you who don't know, is the process where coal companies decided that miners were too expensive. So they just start blowing the tops off of mountains and then taking the coal out, like reaching over in the top and taking the coal out. And so what's left is these sort of like flat structures where mountains used to be, and all of these toxic chemicals that roll down into the valleys, or hollers as they call them. And so I thought that this was sort of an interesting analogy for the ways in which the current racial moment seems sort of hostile in that way, where King's mountaintop vision seems to have been exploded in this moment, and the toxicity of what falls out of that is sort of rolling down into our most vulnerable communities. So I look at this speech where he's doing this, where he's there in 1968 for the sanitation workers' strike, and King is there, and it's an interesting moment for King as well, because he is having a hard time convincing people that nonviolence is a continued strategy. He is working very hard. These protests have turned violent already once before. He's really trying to work through all of this while already being overextended and also being consistently under personal threat. So you'll know that the next day after he presents this speech, Martin Luther King is assassinated. And I argue that Trump supporters in this moment are really, so I'm interested in the ways in which Trump supporters were talking about how Barack Obama just kept infusing race into, Barack Obama talks about nothing but race, when all of this studies suggest, and common knowledge suggests, that Barack Obama didn't talk about race any more than any other American president, and actually in some cases talked about it less. And so why is it that you have this belief that race has become so important in American life and that it's Barack Obama's fault? And ultimately, I argue that it is the power of seeing a black man doing these jobs that forces whites to have to constantly contend with race in a way that is ultimately discomforting. And so discomfort ultimately leads to the default. And the default in this case sends white voters back to whiteness, maleness as authority. And so ultimately, Barack Obama, the argument about Barack Obama really loses face, but he stands as more of a symbol than actually what he has actually done. And so then Martin Luther King uses this concept called dangerous unselfishness, where he is telling these black people in Memphis, like, you have to put your body on the line. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you know any strike workers. It doesn't matter, if you lose your job. It doesn't matter. You have to be out there. And as I'm listening to that, I start to think to myself about the ways in which watching whites vote in a way that is totally inconsistent with the rest of the American population demonstrates what I argue is a sort of dangerous selfishness. And so I'm going to explore this idea of dangerous selfishness in a way that I think is sort of more useful. But I think it's interesting to just say here that I'm interested in the ways that black bodies have always been on the line to negotiate their place in American democracy. King knew that in order to create a beloved community, or our beloved community, as we have all embraced King now. He's even a symbol of the anti-abortion movement. King would have hated that, it turns out. That's what they say. Martin Luther King's dream was not abortions. I saw a person say that on the news. I was like, what? Anyway, one of the things that concerns me greatly is about this push towards dangerous selfishness. And I think it's interesting because what it means is those most vulnerable communities are going to feel the brunt of this first. And so by the time that whites sort of see what they have done, will they be able to have a narrative around it that is about what your decisions have wrought, or will it be a discussion about the ways that black people are lazy, the ways that immigrants or Muslims are terrorists, about the ways that Latinos need to learn how to speak English? Like, will those be the narratives that you use, or will we think carefully about the ways in which we need to unpack what has happened in 2016, which has made it has upset the apple cart in a way that I have never seen in my lifetime. And so I'm trying to sort of put all these things together to see what that actually means. I think that's it. Yes, that's it. Thank you so much.